Chris Clark here at Shaper Studios. Today we're going to glass a surfboard using Entropy Resins Super Sap CLR epoxy resin. This is their clearest resin, which is best for color laminations, which is what we're going to do today. On the deck of a board, you put 2 layers of cloth generally. This is a full deck patch. The first one I cut mid-rail, or just at the top of the rail here. The second one is going to leave long, the same distance all the way around. 2 to 3 inches is pretty good for it to hang. And then you're going to lap it underneath. The shorter you lap it, the less resin it takes up, the lighter the board is, but also the lighter the board is, sometimes that means you're sacrificing strength. So if you want the rails even stronger, you can cut your lap a little bit longer, and that way it takes up more resin and adds a little bit of weight, and as you lap it, it gives you more strength around that rail as you wrap the rail. So the wider the lap is, more strength, but also adds a little bit more weight. Now I'm adding the color pigment to the resin. Stir that together to make sure all the clear mixes in with my color. And then I will add the hardener, which is part B. The Entropy resin takes color just as well, if not better, than other epoxy resins. Just mix the color in with the resin, the part A here on the clear, the CLR by Entropy Resin. So it's a Super Sap CLR. Mixed in the color, and you can see it's a nice consistent color, doesn't distort my pigments at all. So I really like that about the resin. So back to the scale, I'm gonna add my part B CLX hardener. This is an extra fast hardener. So I already added part A, which was 2 parts, to my part B, which is 1 part. So I got the right ratio. Have about 18 minutes or so here in the pot. Well, the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pour it all out onto the surfboard. As it sits in the pot here, it'll start to get hotter and hotter. If I pour it out on the surfboard, it gives me a little longer working life. It's important to get all the resin out of your pot to start with. That way it's not kicking and overheating inside of your pot. So I just want to work it around. I don't want it to slide off the rails. I want to concentrate it mostly to the center of the surfboard, allowing it time to really soak in. Then as it gets to the center and the center looks saturated, I'm going to start to work out towards the rails and get it back into my bucket here. So I'm using most of the resin in its early stages here to saturate the rails, really taking advantage of how easy it saturates. As it gets warmer and hotter, it's going to be a little bit harder to saturate. So I want to make sure I get as much of the surface of the board covered, make sure I get my rails nice and saturated. That's really important. You don't want a dry rail. Dry rail equals a weak rail. So I want to make sure I get a nice even color saturation throughout. Make sure my rails get a nice even color as well. So again, I'm getting the bulk of the resin off the board onto my laps, saturating my laps. Once it's all in my bucket, I pour it right back on top of the board to get it out of my pot. Use that extra resin to go back over and saturate everything on top of the board. Make sure the deck is nice and saturated. I can always pull that extra resin back into my bucket. You can see how the Super Sap gets a nice even color throughout. Saturates the cloth really quickly, which is what I like. That's what you're looking for, is nice, even. When you're working with color, you want an even, consistent color throughout. You don't want it to be splotchy or blotchy anywhere. So I pretty much have that other side of the surfboard already done. The lap is completely saturated. I'm gonna work this extra resin back to the other side of the board, and again, make sure my lap gets a lot of attention early on. So all this extra resin, right off the lap, right into my bucket, saving every ounce I can. Get that lap nice and wet, and then also give it time to drain out. Cool, so all my laps are now saturated. Now, with my extra resin, I'm gonna go back and make sure the deck has enough resin and all my colors consistent throughout. Again, we're doing it opaque, so I wanna make sure there's no tints anywhere. I wanna make sure that it gets a good color spread, good consistency all the way around. Right now, in this meantime, my laps are draining, which means they got heavily saturated with resin, got a great color throughout. Now I'm giving them time. This lap over here has had more time to drain. So when I start to lap, I'm gonna start on this half of the board. And then as I work to this half, this side will have time to have drained as well. So I have quite a bit of extra resin in my pot here. I'm gonna go around and just make sure I have a good consistent color. Make sure there's no air bubbles anywhere. When mixing color, you want to do a couple extra ounces of resin than you normally would use. You want to make sure that you can saturate the board from the glass all the way through the foam with plenty of resin. I also want to make sure at this stage that there's no pooling of resin, so there's a nice even coat of resin over the fiberglass and not too much resin in any one area. So I'm gonna start in the center here and make sure that I have a center point to work forward, and I can also work backwards. If I start at one end, sometimes I don't get the center lined up just right, so I wanna make sure that I start in the middle. This part goes pretty quick, just lapping it underneath from the center towards the tail. And then from the center towards the nose. Same on this side, just gonna go from the center. Forward and back just a little bit. So the center's nice and tucked. Then I can either go forward or back. I'm gonna go back first. Just get my tail finished here. And then work my way from the center back up to the nose. And then my last little diamond, just gonna tuck that one to cover everything up. You see, the Entropy gives you a lot of working life. You have time to really saturate everything, get your laps nice and tucked, and then also time to go back and clean everything up as well. So that's the nice thing about epoxy. Entropy is no different. Nice consistent color throughout. That's what you really want in a color lamp.